I'll be chairing for the rest of the panel, and I will be presenting first, Threats to American Liberal Democracy, Resisting Trumpist Reaction in 2024. So I'll just be reading from some prepared remarks for this. In 2016, a variety of outlets and institutions rang alarm bells about Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Marxist-Humanist Initiative was one of the alarmingly few voices on the left who joined in that outcry. We identified, quote, the extraordinary dangers of Trump and Trumpism, unquote, in an August 2016 editorial of that theme, and were broadly lambasted as alarmist. Looking back at what we wrote then, 8 years on, it is disheartening how accurate we were. On the 6th page of Marxist-Humanist Initiative's pamphlet, Resisting Trumpist Reaction, which is available at our lit table, and was compiled in late 2017, the writers described Trump's unique threat to American liberal democracy. I will now quote extensively from that pamphlet. The more Trump is forced into a corner, the more likely it becomes that he will respond with repressive measures against leftists and liberals, banning our organizations, jailing those of us in the US, inciting violence, etc. It also becomes more likely that he will try to suspend civil liberties, such as voting rights, freedom of speech, and rights of those charged with crimes. He may even take extraordinary measures to protect himself and his family and friends from prosecution and impeachment, such as trying to suspend parts of the Constitution and trying to put himself above the law by pardoning himself in advance of criminal charges, unquote. The issue is not one of prophecy or I told you so. As we explained in the pamphlet at the time, there is a deeper issue that allowed us to be frank and cogent about these matters, while others on the left failed to recognize them. I will quote again from our pamphlet. To put it bluntly, it did not take great insight to predict that Trump would do the things he said he would do. The crucial point is to understand why we were able to predict this when they, others on the left, were not. It did not take great skill on our part to reject the many rationalizations for waiting and seeing what Trump might do, or for giving him the benefit of the doubt. MHI was able to see what was coming because we have no interests separate and apart from the interests of working people and freedom movements, of African Americans and other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination. Consequently, we were not burdened by a desire to spin events with the aim of capitalizing on them to advance the special interests of our organization or our program for action. We saw what was coming because we analyzed trends and take action on the basis of principles derived from Marx's philosophy of revolution. This philosophy looks to the independent, emancipatory self-activity of the masses and a philosophy of human liberation as the motive forces for social change. It does not regard any party, movement, or program that allegedly represents the masses as the motive force for social change. It rejects, as substitutionist, all notions that the interests of a particular party, movement, or program are tantamount to the interests of humanity, unquote. This is a good time to make a brief note on Trump derangement syndrome. Marxist-Humanist Initiative in our editorials and articles on the struggle against Trumpism has strove to be cogent, theoretical, and precise. We have never shied away from dialogue on this matter, but many of the responses to our work on this matter have called us alarmists, liberals, or sufferers of TDS. This doesn't just serve to shut down discussion, but to ignore and erase the breadth and depth of our work on this matter. Our work has been dedicated to engaging with the reality of what Trumpism means and what fuels it, and what does fuel this existential threat to liberal democracy. In his essay, Combating White Nationalism, Lessons from Marx, Andrew Kliman demonstrated, quote, that, quote, by looking back at the presidential campaigns of George Wallace between 1964 and 1972, it becomes clear that Trumpism is a manifestation of a long-standing white nationalist strain in US politics, not a response to neoliberalism or globalization. Trump, unquote, that concludes the quotation. Trump emerged onto the political scene in 2016, seemingly out of nowhere, but his base of support was long pre-existing. There was much prevaricating about and spreading of information about this base in the months after his election. But what is clear is that these were not economically distressed anti-neoliberal protest voters, but an already extant authoritarian white nationalist base. As we wrote in our November 2023 editorial, "What Can Stop Trumpism?" I will now quote extensively from that editorial. In short, the history of the United States from its founding to the present is a history of failures and unwillingness to fully defeat and root out white supremacy. It persists as an ideology, as do its economic and political manifestations. Racial and other progress has been met time and again with flare-ups of reaction that have never been extinguished after they flare up. Thus, they flare up again. This has brought us to the crisis we now face. The problem is not that white supremacy is winning. To the contrary, white supremacist forces now feel themselves to have been on the losing side again and again as a result of civil rights era laws, court decisions, cultural changes, and demographic trends, including immigration. And they have become more and more desperate. During the last several years, their desperation and grievances have increasingly become intertwined with those of Trump himself, who now faces the threat of imprisonment and the dismantling of his business empire. He is the personification of their desperation and their grievances, and he cultivates that persona, unquote. For Trump and his base supporters, this is an existential struggle. He fears jail time, and his base supporters fear white replacement. They are willing to fight dirty. They have shown this again and again and again. They have embraced the tactics of political violence and are openly planning to dismantle the levers of democracy that could check Trump's power if he were to return to office. Much damage has already been done, including the slew of efforts to further suppress votes, especially those of black voters. Still, some on the left, 8 years later, are not willing to recognize this as an existential struggle for democracy. The Trumpists and Trump himself are very open about their aims, but we still hear the same platitudes about how Trump's disruptive effect will provide us, on the left, with an opportunity. What this line of thinking misses is that there are people suffering from this disruption, those being disrupted or suppressed, disempowered, and maybe even worse, are the working class and black masses of this country. It is a savage, greedy selfishness that causes a narrow-minded left to look at that as an opportunity to grow the ranks of their mailing list or to sell more books. The Democratic Party does recognize this as an existential threat, but it is completely and structurally incapable of imagining a way to combat it. Democrats are still talking about soundly defeating Trump at the ballot box, as if that hasn't already happened. Allow me to quote again from our above-mentioned What Can Stop Trumpism editorial. Quote, "It is baked into the structure of the Democratic Party, which is a purely electoral party without even a base of rank-and-file members. Democratic politicians campaign to win elections. Strategists help them. They and people close to the party try to turn out the vote. This is what they do and all they do. And this structure dictates the limits of their vision and their proposals. They are not revolutionaries and they are not grassroots activists. They don't even think about lending concerted assistance to the spontaneous efforts, the resistance, Me Too, the Black Lives Matter uprising, March for Our Lives, that have been striving in various ways to create the mass movement that could stop Trumpism by such means as are necessary. It just isn't part of the job description of the Democratic Party. This situation is not going to change. As we wrote in an editorial prior to the 2020 election, wishing the Democratic Party will become something that it is not is futile, unquote. So the time for drawing a line in the sand against Trumpism and saying this far but no farther has long since passed. It is not enough to just stop the dismantling of American liberal democracy, but work has to be done to repair the already serious damage and to tear out white nationalism and white supremacy by the root. We need more than just resistance to Trumpist encroachment. We need a mass mobilization for democracy. And that mobilization needs to have a positive component, namely the expansion of civil liberties, protection of voting rights, legal consequences for insurrectionists, and the democratizing of undemocratic institutions. Such a fight would need to mobilize sectors of the American proletariat typically excluded from democracy, ironically felons, undocumented workers, the homeless, and others. making those groups more fully a part of a polity committed to not just halting Trumpism, but also to expanding human liberty in this country. The Democrats are not interested in this project, but the left can be. Trumpism is a politics of dehumanization. The authoritarian white nationalist base that rallied around Trump in 2016 responded to his contempt for immigrants. During his presidency, Trump literally and figuratively set the dogs loose on undocumented men, women, and children, empowering ICE to use draconian methods against immigrants. One of his first responses of the COVID crisis was to bow to demands from the meatpacking industry to sign an executive order to keep meat plants open. The meatpacking industry has a high density of undocumented workers, and with close quarters working conditions on plant floors, it saw a high rate of both COVID infection and death. According to the Pew Research Center poll in 2021, not poll, but study in 2021, about 7.8 million undocumented workers are in the American labor force. Those workers who, due to their undocumented status, are often forced into working the most miserable, alienated, and unsafe jobs in this country, have a stake in the struggle against Trumpism. Democrats are disinterested in this issue and can be almost as ruthless in their own immigration policy, but these workers can be a part of a positive mass movement. Women and others affected by the disastrous Dobbs decision are fighting to expand abortion rights through ballot measures across the country. Those fights have the potential to move beyond just preserving those rights, but achieving more abortion access than ever existed, even under Roe. Again, the Democrats are unable and unwilling to move beyond what already existed. Their slogan, Restore Roe, is far from free abortion on demand. Trans people asserting their humanity is not an inconvenient issue, but a ground on which we can all assert our rights to bodily autonomy by practicing real solidarity. The rampant misogyny, transphobia, and homophobia of the Trumpists must be positively attacked with an expansion of civil liberties for abortion access, trans rights, and queer legal protections. Trump has empowered racist police against the black-led efforts for racial justice. The lively, thinking masses that took to the streets in record numbers 4 years ago after the racist police murder of George Floyd were a part of Trump's electoral defeat in 2020. To defeat Trumpism, the movement for Black lives and against racist police violence and white nationalism has to be empowered and aided, not just appeased, which is all the Democratic Party is interested in doing. The week's big news was the guilty verdict of Trump on 34 felony counts. Well, this is good, and I personally welcome all legal movements against Trump. We can't pretend this is enough anymore. The courthouse and the ballot box are only palliatives. Maybe in 2016, but at this point, as I've already said, the only correction to Trumpism is a positive mass movement for human liberation. It goes without saying what I've already said time and again in this presentation, that the Democrats cannot, will not, and are not able to aid the spontaneous outbursts against Trumpism. But what of the left? Aren't we supposed to be better than the Democrats? Aren't we supposed to be on the side of the masses against dehumanization, white nationalism, and incipient fascism? Where has the left been for the past 8 years of the struggle against Trumpism? Amazingly, there has been consistent minimization of the threat of Trumpism, which still persists to this day. Not content just being stuck in 2016, many in the left are stuck even further in the past, as they are still playing Cold War campus politics in the 21st century. These campuses have sided with Putin and other authoritarians abroad. It's a given that the Democratic Party won't come to support the masses and movement, but a left that is unwilling, unable, and uninterested in doing so is not revolutionary in spirit or practice. This left, the soft on Trump left, the self-interested left, must be broken with and abandoned. They only pay lip service to socialism. There isn't time left to quibble over the risks faced by a Trumpism back in power. Those are self-evident to anyone without their head in the sand. It's time to take it seriously.
A few months ago, when we first thought about what to talk about here, it was still not widely accepted that the courts were in the pocket of the many of them in the pocket of the right-wing Trumpites. Now, however, it is, with the exception of the Supreme New York last Thursday, doing a good job on the case against Trump for his criminality. But in general, what's been coming down from the higher courts, particularly the Supreme Court, can't get any higher, is the most misogynist, racist, anti-democratic, anti-voting rights stuff that's ever come down, and it boggles the mind. When I was a kid, a long, long time ago, we used to hope that we could get test cases into the federal courts and have the protections of the U.S. Constitution, whereas the state courts were still very racist and misogynistic. And now that's completely the opposite. The only ones who might give you some relief are states like New York and California, where there's some civil rights and civil liberties embedded, put into their constitutions, and have grounds in which to sue. But it's all being chipped away at. It's like, I can't even think about federal law anymore because it changes every day, it gets more reactionary. And the case that came down last week that I wanted to mention, it's South Carolina versus the South Carolina NAACP. They were sued over the voting districts because they had been gerrymandered, and they had been gerrymandered so badly that a map had previously been thrown out by the courts, and they were working with a new map, and there was a new argument against this map, and the new argument was that, one, it was racist, it was meant to bleach African American voters out of the Charleston County portion, Congressional District number 1. I had never heard of this term before, but bleaching African American voters is what was going on. But secondly, they argued that it was aimed against people who voted in certain political ways. And the court held that there wasn't a racial problem because they'd already taken care of that when the previous map had been thrown out, and that they weren't going to do anything about, they weren't going to take jurisdiction over a complaint that the purpose of the gerrymandering was to get all the Democrats out of the district. Although that's clearly what it was, the court decided that wasn't illegal or unconstitutional. And my hair stood on end. And so everything's like completely upside down and inside out. Now it's not okay to gerrymander on the basis of race, except they all do, and it gets upheld. But it's also not illegal to gerrymander on another basis, on the basis of there's too many Democrats in that district or whatever. This is crazy. This is going to make total chaos. Every congressional district and every other kind of district is going to be challenged and thrown out. It'll be impossible to win an election and get any results of who won anything, right? You all heard Trump complain that he couldn't get a fair trial in Manhattan because it was with 95% Democrats or something, which isn't even correct. But let's hope he doesn't appeal. Probably will, probably appeal on every basis, but on the basis of that he should have been granted a change in venue to some place where there were fewer Democrats in the jury pool. It'd be impossible to have a trial anyway. I mean, if everybody did this, it's just insane, but the Supreme Court upheld it. They gave up on trying to eliminate racial discrimination when they haven't done so at all. And now they're saying, well, you can discriminate on the basis of anything you want, and we'll say it's okay. So I just wanted to mention that because voting rights are like the most basic, essential of civil rights. It was the beginning of the civil rights movement. It was over the black people not being allowed to register to vote. People were killed over that. Many, many campaigns in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and some people said, oh, well, it's only voting. I mean, some modern leftists said, oh, who cares about voting, it's not important. But it was and is important, and people died and are still willing to die over that right, because it's like the core right we have to try to change anything by democratic means. So get out there and defend your right to vote, and everyone else's. What can I say?
Okay, so my talk is called After Navalny Our Turn. I'm going to be repeating some themes that others have mentioned, but they bear repeating. What I want to talk about is why did and does the pro-Trump and soft-on-Trump so-called left, why did they fail to grasp the proto-fascist character of Trump's base of support? And I want to go into 5 of what I think are the main factors. We'll go through them all individually. What I want to do is suggest that these kinds of leftists jettison their brand of leftism and start over before it's too late, if it isn't already too late. So the first point I want to get to is the fact that there was a pro-Trump and soft-on-Trump left that did fail to grasp the pro-fascist character of Trump's base. Back in 2016, when Trump won an electoral college victory, the consensus explanation of the pro and soft-on-Trump left was a story that blamed their neoliberal adversaries and held out hope of their own, the left's own ultimate triumph. They said that Trump's victory was due to the forgotten white working class, which rose up against decades of neoliberalism, globalization, and financialization. For instance, Cornel West, who's running for president this year, said that the election of Trump was a desperate and xenophobic cry of human hearts for a way out from under the devastation of a disintegrating neoliberal order. White working and middle-class fellow citizens rejected the economic neglect of neoliberal policies and the self-righteous arrogance of elites. Boris Kagarlitsky said that the votes of workers brought Trump to victory, not the so-called white men, but the working class, an uprising of the forgotten and resentful provincial America against the spoiled people in California and the cosmopolitan officials from Washington. And David K. Johnston at the same time said that Trump won because many millions of Americans, having endured decades of working more while getting deeper in debt, said enough. In case you're not familiar with the name Boris Kagarlitsky, and because it's relevant to the issue of campism that I'll be talking about, as well as the title of this talk, After Navalny Our Turn, let me say the following. A self-styled Marxist theorist, Kagarlitsky was a Putin apologist and leader of the so-called patriotic left in Russia. He supported Russia's annexation of Crimea and pro-Russian separatist movements in the Donbass region. But then, more recently, Kagarlitsky criticized Putin's current war to conquer Ukraine. But authoritarians like Putin and Trump demand total obedience. So it didn't go over so well for Gabriel. On February 13, a military court sentenced him to 5 years in prison, where he's sitting right now. In any case, the story that Trump's base is rebelling against neoliberalism, globalization, and financialization eventually became very hard to sustain for two main reasons. One is that an overwhelming consensus of dozens of studies by social scientists found very little, if any, evidence for that claim. For instance, I did one such study of people who had voted for Obama in 2012, but flipped to Trump in 2016. And my findings matched the consensus view very well. I found that these so-called Obama to Trump voters, their support for Trump had nothing, literally nothing to do with experiencing economic hardship or lack of education, and that the flip to Trump was driven by their Trumpian, deplorable attitudes about race, gender, immigration, and authoritarianism. And the other reason that this story about Trump's base being a rebellion against neoliberalism, the other reason it became hard to sustain is, of course, that the news became dominated by the actual issues that get the MAGA base's juices flowing. Issues having to do with authoritarianism, racism, sexism, not with opposition to neoliberalism. So you got the Unite the Right in Charlottesville, you got the insurrection of January 6th, you got the current revenge campaign of Trump and his vow to root out the communist, Marxist, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country. That's what he's promising. Okay, now my second point is that this is not just a thing of the past. The pro and soft on Trump left is still at it, still failing to grasp the character of the MAGA base. For example, just 6 weeks ago in an article by a couple of these people in Jacobin, Jacobin published that, surprise, surprise, the authors Bessner and Steinmetz Jenkins ridiculed what they alleged to be liberals' quote, heated fascism rhetoric and quote, apocalyptic rhetoric of looming fascism and total democratic collapse. That's pretty much the standard Jacobin line. Okay? They said, we don't deny, okay, that Trump's re-election poses real danger. So the line has been changed again. They don't deny the facts and regale us with alternative facts about neoliberalism, but now they're instructing us to downplay the facts because focusing on the facts isn't politically expedient. They say we don't deny that it poses real dangers. Trump and his supporters are not especially concerned with heeding the people's will. One imagines that in Trump's ideal world he would rule by fiat, but how does diagnosing fascism, which implicitly categorizes millions of Americans as a group to be expunged rather than won over, how does that help us reform our undemocratic political system, et cetera, et cetera? Simply put, they say it doesn't. Really? How does refusing to identify the danger properly, refusing to call it what it is, how does that help us to combat it? How does normalizing Trumpism, treating it as a legitimate rival, for people's allegiances, not as a threat and abomination to be eliminated, help us to combat it? These authors want to win over, not combat, a MAGA base that is driven by the thirst for authoritarian rule, racism, misogyny, xenophobia. How does it help to win them over without combating their ideology and aspirations? Simply put, it doesn't. Okay, but why is the so-called left, represented by this Jacobin article, wedded to this counterproductive and bizarre accommodation to Trumpism? Why is it objectively to the right of liberals? Why is it to the right of liberals and even to the right of never Trump conservatives. I think there's, like I say, 5 main reasons that I've been able to work out with my colleagues and comrades in the Marxist-Humanist Initiative. The first is what we call left-first orientation. Just like Trump is all about America first, these people are left first. Their primary concern is to, quote, build the left and win victories, elections, campaigns, adherence, power for themselves. And this is the exact opposite of Marx's position. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx emphasized that communists have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. And I think left-firstism explains why these people are constantly railing against liberals and neoliberals while constantly minimizing the threat of fascism. They're trying to brand themselves, distinguish themselves from the liberals. They're trying to attract followers who would otherwise turn to neoliberalism or liberalism. They want to gain the allegiance of people from liberal backgrounds who become disaffected with liberalism. And building up their own power in this way is a main concern of theirs. Secondly, I think there's a lot of economic populist pandering going on. Because of their left-firstism, these folks are not trying to help bring the masses or the working class to power. They regard regular people as a constituency to win over in their quest for their own political power. And they don't mind winning them over by so-called meeting them where they're at. So what they do is they offer a version of populism that they hope the MAGA base will find appealing. What's driving that base is an authoritarian, white nationalist version of populism, but they're hoping that the MAGA base will regard economic populism, 99% versus 1%, as an acceptable substitute, without first having to combat that base's authoritarianism and white nationalism head on. No, just offered some economic populism is their view. Okay, a third factor, I think, is that these people actually did, and probably still do, misunderstand trends in inequality. The economic populist pandering rests largely on a false belief that the rise of Trumpism was a working class revolt against decades of economic distress that supposedly was inflicted by neoliberalism and financialization. One thing wrong with this belief is the notion that economic concerns, rather than authoritarianism and white nationalism, are behind the rise of Trumpism. But the other is that the supposed rise in income inequality and wealth inequality has been tremendously exaggerated by people like Thomas Piketty, Sayez, and Zuckman, his co-authors, and the people who parrot them. Incomes of the working class incomes of people in the working class in the U.S. did not stagnate under neoliberalism, not when income is measured in a reasonable way. And in fact, Piketty and his co-authors have admitted that it did not stagnate. They've admitted that for the last 8 years. Their revised data show that between 1982 and 2014, the real, after inflation, per person after-tax income of the bottom 90% of the population increased by 45%. And for the middle 40% of the population, the increase was 53%, and so forth. And also, what Piketty and so on claim regarding the rise in the income and wealth of the top 1% is extremely controversial among actual researchers. It's not generally accepted. Okay, so if you look at the left-hand column, it's the share of income of the top 1%, which is the Piketty curve. It's the one that doesn't look like the others. Okay, right-hand side, the income, the wealth share of the top 1%, which is the Piketty, Sayez, etc. curve, the one that does not look like the others, the green one. Okay, so there are a whole lot of problems with their estimates, very controversial, I could say a lot more about that, but I don't have time to. So just the takeaway right now is these are not just brute facts, these are very controversial claims. Okay, I also want to talk about campism, which I think is a very big deal these days. What are called campists, they regard the split between the so-called imperialist camp, meaning the US and its allies and clients, and what they wrongly call the anti-imperialist camp, which includes such lovely regimes as Putin's in Russia, Assad's in Syria, and so on. They regard this split in the world as the single fundamental split. Campism has become an increasingly prevalent tendency on the left in recent years. And if you have this kind of nursery tale conception of the geopolitical order, you know, the imperialist camp, the anti-imperialist camp, you're just not going to grasp the proto-fascist character of Trump's base. Because the threat of fascism here at home isn't your main concern. Your main concerns are to weaken the power of the US and its allies, to support Putin's multipolarity, that is his drive to gain control of Ukraine and other countries in Europe, and so on. And given Trump's America First isolationism and his hostility to the US's NATO allies and the fact that he's Putin's poodle, it kind of follows inevitably that the campists' main enemies are liberals and neoliberals, not the prospect of fascism in the US. And then there is this after Hitler, our turn view. The returning to the 1930s. Okay, prior to Hitler taking power in Germany, the Stalinist world line was that the Social Democrats were fascist, okay, or that social democracy led to fascism. And the strategy was the Communist parties should fight social democracy rather than fascism. And the German Communist Party slavishly followed this line until 1933, when Hitler came to power. It did not turn out well for them. The Communist Party, Germany's entire membership, was either killed or sent to the first Nazi concentration camps. But fighting the liberals and the neoliberals rather than the looming fascist threat goes hand in hand with campism. And it dovetails nicely with a left-first orientation where you emphasize the left against the liberals, you know, and the neoliberals just like you emphasize the communists against the social democrats. Okay, now, you know, there's always people who think that this time is different, as well as naive numpties who don't know about last time. So as some people have noted, there are people saying we can survive Trump 2.0, but we can't survive Biden and the Democratic Party. So somebody on Twitter responded, they're really doing the after Hitler our turn thing in 2024. And somebody else says, look, the DSA is not going to survive a second Trump term, you naive numpty. So there are people who don't know about last time. But in fact, the after Trump our turn politics may turn out okay for those who are willing to remake themselves into the US version of Russia's patriotic left. Like, no, the Kagalinsky, thank you. Okay, it might turn out okay for them, but they should be aware that total obedience is going to be demanded from Trump and his ilk. Who it's not going to turn out for well are black people in this country, brown people, immigrants, Jews, women, working people, and genuine leftists, as well as liberals and anti-Trump Republicans and people the world over. Okay, so anybody who's on the pro-Trump left or the soft on Trump so-called left that has any concern for the rest of us should jettison their brand of leftism, lock, stock, and barrel, and start over before it's too late, if it isn't already. Thank you.
All right, so Andrew talked about campism a little bit in his presentation. I'm gonna talk about it much more because it's a big issue. So yeah, my talk is about campism, but it's also about an alternative to it. By campism, I mean the principle that the fundamental division in the world is between an imperialist camp, which corresponds to the United States and its allies, and a so-called anti-imperialist camp, which corresponds to countries with anti-American or Western regimes. The alternative I'm offering is the Marxist-Humanist idea or principle that there are two worlds in every country. I think it is important to talk about an alternative to campism because it is a factor holding back an international movement against authoritarianism, including against imminent Trumpist fascism in the United States. For example, campists have refused to aid progressive movements in Afghanistan, Ukraine and Russia, and Iran, among other countries, ostensibly because these regimes are anti-imperialist. Thus, a central tenet of campism is that these certain states are progressive forces that will end American imperialism, and the people fighting against these so-called progressive states are imperialist stooges. Marxist humanism does not conceive of the world as divided into two camps. Instead, we see that in every country there is a world of rulers and the world of those fighting for freedom against those rulers. For us, this principle holds in the United States as much as it holds in Afghanistan, Russia, Iran, or anywhere else. Thus, in all cases, our concern is supporting the struggle of progressive and revolutionary movements against the regimes they are fighting. In this talk, I will discuss Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Iran to discern the differences between the above-mentioned campus and Marxist-Humanist principles. What I want you to get out of this talk is that the campus principle leads the left to work against or remain aloof from democratic social movements. Thus, when this principle is applied in the United States, it leads the left to accommodate Trumpism. So, first, about Afghanistan. One of the first MHI, Marxist-Humanist Initiative editorials published in our publication with sober senses is called "We Protest, We Condemn." In it, we recount an experience of ours at an international socialist organization conference. I now quote from the editorial at length. We attended the conference to hear the Afghan feminist and human rights advocate Malala Hoya, who was on tour promoting her book, A Woman Among Warlords. Hoya had been expelled from the Afghan parliament for speaking the truth about the warlords in the government. She gave a beautiful speech calling for women's rights and democracy as well as an end to the US war. The ISO still proceeded to speak as if the only matter to be discussed was US imperialism. One of us got the floor and repeated Hoya's call to support the Afghans' own struggle against their rulers and oppressors, adding that our talking about this was a way to build the US anti-war movement. At the end of our members' remarks, Hoya got up, bent down over the edge of the stage, and kissed her on both cheeks. Whereupon an ISO speaker jumped up to say, on the contrary, that we should engage only in knee-jerk anti-US imperialism. His words. That's the end of the quote from our editorial. We argue in this editorial that the unconditional support for regimes, simply because they are anti-American or anti-Western, quote, can only hurt oppressed people in other countries, endanger leftists here by giving the government an excuse to attack the left, and cripple the left's ability to build mass movements against US policies, end quote. It is the point we make about crippling the left's ability to build mass movements against US policies, or in the present day, Trumpism, that I want to dwell on. The politics expressed by the ISO speakers involve a treacherous substitution. The ISO speakers identified Afghanistan's rulers as the anti-imperialist forces, rather than the Afghan people fighting to end the war and for women's rights and democracy. In other words, they substituted the principle of bourgeois nationalism for proletarian internationalism. They substituted the defense of states for the development of people-to-people solidarity across nations. I want to clarify that I use the word treacherous advisedly. The abandonment of proletarian internationalism is a betrayal of social revolution. The ISO speakers failed to credit mass movements for freedom as the forces of revolution. Instead, they chose to support the alleged lesser evil. Thus, they suggested that neither the people of Afghanistan nor the anti-war movement in the US should be considered the main agents in the battle against American imperialism. I believe it is this willful blindness to the revolutionary potential of democratic mass movements that holds back much of the American left from building a, quote, mass movement independent of capitalist interests and politics to fight Trump and Trumpism on the ground, end quote. On March 7, 2022, Marxist-Humanist Initiative published another editorial. Ukraine fights for national self-determination against Russian imperialism. Again, this editorial condemns the so-called anti-imperialist left for defending and supporting reactionary regimes, in this case, Russia. Further, it argues that the left should support the resistance effort in Ukraine and the massive opposition within Russia and around the world to the invasion and war. Importantly, the editorial also argues that, quote, Trumpism and Putinism are two facets in one of the same struggle. They are two manifestations of a rising global tide of authoritarianism and rejection of liberal democracy, end quote. To defend Putinism, then, is to accommodate Trumpism. So on the one hand, we have campists who are defending Putin's regime, which has interfered with American democracy, and Putinism, which shares an ideological affinity with Trumpism, to say nothing about its effects yet on Russia, the Russian masses, or people in Ukraine, or the rest of Eastern Europe for that matter. In other words, in the case of Ukraine, campists have clearly aligned themselves with the world of rulers in both Russia and America, paradoxically underneath the guise of fighting against America. On the other hand, Marxist-Humanist Initiative has aligned itself with Ukrainian socialists, feminists, and labor unions, who are playing a significant role in the resistance and the pro-democracy forces in Russia. Let me demonstrate how our position is not paradoxical. In a Commons Journal article entitled Resistance and Solidarity, the Left Volunteer Movement in the Russo-Ukrainian War, Vladislav Starbustev describes how leftists, quote, fighting side by side in the army allows for strengthening the left authority and building new contacts, end quote. Further, he describes how, quote, the state's impotence in filling its social role formed a vacuum filled by decentralized cooperation, end quote. By this, the author meant that socialists, students, and workers had come together to find ways to meet the daily survival needs of Ukrainians and to develop eco-socialist and eco-anarchist alternatives to their own government's economic policies. MHI supports the Ukrainian resistance, which is not the same as the Ukrainian government, because we see the right of nations to self-determination as a precondition to a truly human transformation of society. This is harmonious with the reality that through their mass resistance to Russian imperialism, Ukrainians are helping lay the foundation of a freer and more democratic post-war Ukraine. To realize this post-war society, however, they must be victorious in the war. If we pay attention, the mass resistance in Ukraine provides lessons to the American left regarding the fight against Trumpism. First, the left wing of the Ukrainian resistance shows that it is possible to fight imperialism and the policies of one's own government simultaneously. Second, it shows that people in Russia are transforming Ukrainian society through mass democratic resistance to the Russian invasion. The lessons I draw from these two dimensions of the struggle in Ukraine are that the American left can fight alongside anti-Trump forces while maintaining political independence from the Democrats and liberals, and that we may be able to expand and transform American democracy through the struggle to preserve it. Now I'll finish my last example talking about Iran. I chose Iran as my last example for 3 reasons. The first is that campists have a long history of defending the Islamic Republic of Iran, despite it not representing any fundamental challenge to capitalist production, virtually eliminating women's rights, and having virtually no rights for LGBTQ people. Outlawing independent workers' organizations, suppressing multiple movements for national autonomy, and having one of the highest execution rates in the world, among other indefensible qualities. The second reason is that recently, another mass movement emerged in Iran, this time led by women and youth, explicitly calling for an end to the Islamic Republic. This movement clearly showed that the country of Iran is divided into rulers on one side and freedom fighters on the other side. Yet, there has been no significant change in the campus position on the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is that it is a progressive force due to its alleged anti-imperialism. The third reason is that using Iran as an example demonstrates that campism is no new phenomenon on the left, and that Marxist-Humanist opposition to it is nothing new either. During the 1979 revolution in Iran, most of the Marxist left supported the Islamic Republican Party, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, on the grounds that he was trying to establish an anti-imperialist regime. Donnelly, on the other hand, said that Khomeini was a second Shah who was trying to, quote, complete the counter-revolution, end quote. Instead of supporting Khomeini, she urged the left to support what she called the true revolutionary forces: the proletariat, the peasantry, the ethnic minorities fighting for self-determination, the women's liberation movement, the revolutionary intellectuals, and the youth. The significance of the Marxist-Humanist position in 1979 was that we had identified the two worlds in Iran even before Khomeini's faction consolidated its power in the post-revolutionary years. In other words, while many Marxists were being pulled into supporting what would become a truly horrific regime, we were able to identify the revolutionary forces within Iran, fighting both American imperialism and the counter-revolution in their own country. If the left did this in the United States today, it would mean acknowledging that in America, there is more than just a world of rulers and owners competing for control of the world's resources and human lives. We would also have to acknowledge that there is a world in the United States of regular people from around the globe fighting against a political movement headed by a particularly grim representative of the American capitalist class, Donald Trump. If we continue to ignore this, continue to ignore that in every country the new society is, quote, gestating in the old, end quote, as Donnelly has said. By ignoring this, we abdicate our responsibilities as revolutionaries. In all the cases I have discussed, much of the left continued to hold on to the campist idea of the world being divided into two camps. This meant defending anti-American regimes no matter how atrocious. In fact, it meant elevating this support for reactionary regimes into a principle of international solidarity. Thus, it also meant remaining aloof or actively working against each country's progressive and revolutionary forces. In every case, Marxist-Humanists provided an alternative, embraced the idea that there are two worlds in every country, and by doing so, commit yourself to supporting mass movements for freedom in every country. MHI has held to this principle even when it means challenging so-called anti-imperialist regimes. We have also held this principle in relationship to the United States, which is why we can see the revolutionary potential of mass democratic movements there. The concern I'm trying to communicate that is if the left continues to identify states Rather than mass movements as the force that can defeat American imperialism, we divert attention away from progressive movements worldwide and within the United States. Today, this means helping consolidate the atrocious regime Trump will reign over if he's elected again. Thank you.